of owning a cafe and other heroic deeds by Beware the Tistero. Chapter 121 of Fathers and Father Figures. Part 2. Watching his lover and their guardian enter the cell containing a man he'd love to get his gloveless hands on, Tomra allowed his shoulders to relax as he sat next to Mandalay and watched the security monitors. You know, I never liked the guy before you and your friends brought him to justice, and I'd only ever seen him from a distance at pro-hero conferences and on interviews. Blinking, he turned to the cat-based hero who was scowling lightly at the screen. You and your partner, you're two incredibly rare and special people, she acknowledged with a smile, her expression softening. To grow into such fine young men after being raised by those bastards? She sighed, her head shaking. It's no wonder that Chill always talks about you so highly when it comes here to babysit our number one big bad, she added with a wink, her words causing him to blush.
He talks to you guys about us, huh?
He smiled, his body relaxing further. Are you kidding? The guy won't shut up about you, Tommy, Hitoshi, and all the other kiddos who go to your cafe, she told him, her eyes glittering with mirth. Hell, when I first met everyone, I half expected you to have shimmering auras and halos or something. She giggled through a little wistful sigh. Oh, Matter sure is lucky to have a man like that for a fiancé. Not that I'm jealous or anything, she continued sheepishly, whilst covering her mouth with her hand as he snorted at her. The curse of the alluring cat dad strikes again, he thought a little ruefully. The day he realizes what kind of power and influence he wields is the day a new world order, the likes of which Sensei could only dream of, will come around, won't it? His mind helpfully supplied through a chuckle. That wasn't such a terrible idea now, was it? Speaking of which, and I, don't mean to pry, but, the woman sat beside him continued, I thought that our similar piece might have been with you today, she admitted. As childish as it sounds, I was kind of hoping for an autograph, you know? Chuckling at her earnestness, Tomra shook his head at her.
Don't worry about it, he grinned. I'll get him to sign some things for you and on a day when you're free. Just come in the cafe to pick him up. Better yet, if you text Tomoni and Nemni when you're coming, I'm sure they can grapple him into meeting you properly if you like.
He furthered, her eyes widening. I wouldn't want to impose, she gasped bashfully. I mean, the Nordoneko is his sanctuary, isn't it? His PR team must have to work ridiculously hard to keep the news hounds from snooping into his reasons for being in that area of Musutavu, right? She mused, even as her tone became giddier. But if you're sure you wouldn't meet too much trouble, my cousin Yawara would be blown away if I got his signature. He's been an all-mighty fan since he debuted, and this could just tempt him away from Hokkaido. She grinned. It's always been a dream of mine to form a hero group with him around our old hometown up in the mountains, you know? She tittered before snagging her cell phone and tapping away at it excitedly. Snuckerito himself, the decayed quirk user aside, and leaned into the hard foam couch they'd sat on. He once again found himself craving the lived-in comfort of their sofas back home. Home. Something he never thought he'd have after the accident. Something that Sensei had told him couldn't be his in the cruel, heartless society he'd been training to topple, to destroy by any means necessary. God, how wrong he'd been. How awful he felt for once believing that mass murder, destruction, and cruelty was the only way to make the world understand the flaws in a civilization based on heroes. Heroes whom he'd hated, despised, and saw as obstacles in his way. Obstacles who weren't people, with family lives and problems of their own. Before he'd met Dabi online, then in person, his witty quibs, roguish smile, and tender touches a revelation. Before he dared to leave his room, the upscale apartment he'd been given, and visit the cafe filled with life, laughter, and color. Before he'd been embraced by Sho, his calm demeanor and rational approach to caring for those who'd been ostracized by the wider, wealthier parts of the city mind-blowing. Welcomed by Hitoshi, who'd offered him his friendship and fraternity without batting an eye at his cracked skin and self-esteem issues. Adored by Izuku, who'd seen his curse as something useful and important, who'd called him Nisan and sought his company. Accepted by the Smalls, each of them looking up to him and hanging on his every word as though he was important. Before he'd been introduced to actual pros who'd been schooled, harangued, and enlightened by their cat dad's honest, no-bullshit approach to people, their attitudes swiftly changing for the better through words, examples, and actions, as opposed to threats, violence, and murder. before he'd seen the effects of learning not to judge, not to care about appearances, to feed the hungry even if they couldn't pay, to value the quirkless, to offer help to anyone and everyone who needed it, regardless of who they were or where they'd come from, to connect people through a cork board full of contact details and information on a wall, through a study space peppered with books and older computers that still worked, through a youth center focused on entertainment, team skills, and career paths, to see the man who'd rationally approach situations that most people would run from step up to become his guardian when anyone else would have thrown him into the nearest prison cell or mental health facility because of the threat he posed. That same man even baking pies for and spending time with a villain so old, so legendary that the HPSC tried to cover up his existence altogether, just for the opportunity to save more lives and try, in whatever extent he could, to rehabilitate the fiend through kindness and conversation instead of more violence. That's why he wasn't surprised to see his lover and their cat dad emerging from Todoroki's cell, only 15 minutes after entering, with smiles splitting their faces and Dabi looking lighter, looking happier for having said his piece. He could only hope for the same now, couldn't he? Being wheeled into the interview room had never felt so pleasing. Ah, do my old eyes deceive me? 3 visitors as opposed to 1? My, how delightful! He purred out as the 6 men responsible for transporting him the whole 50 yards or so from his cell to this chamber brought the chair he was caged in to rest before a now familiar desk. So, to what do I owe this pleasure, Oh, how entertaining! Oh, how marvelous to see his former protege, Todoroki's whelp, and their dear guardian, all lined up before him with Tomura sat in the middle, his eyes locked with his. The anger, the accusation sparking in his crimson eyes. Ravenous!
I asked to come see you, said Shigaraki-san.
The boy stated, his expression resolved. Did you now? He murmured as though he hadn't known, as though he didn't frequently leave this boring place through astral projection to tour around his territory, Garaki's labs, places of interest for the future, and one darling little cafe filled with all manner of interesting people and opportunities. Well, my boy, here I am, he declared. Come now, don't be shy. He furthered happily. Ask me your questions, tell me your truths. I'll not be offended. He shrugged. Wasn't I always so patient with you, Didn't I give you anything and everything you wanted, back when you considered me family? Did I not save you when no one else would? He sighed. Surely you're not so ungrateful. Why, you'd never have stumbled your way across this surly beau of yours and your current benefactor, if not for me, would you, He smirked, his eyes momentarily flitting to Dabi. Oh, is that your father's temper I see there, young man? Oi. Enter Aizawa Shouta's greatest strength and most devastating weakness. His big bleeding heart. Don't offer him the chance to speak with you, and then fill it with your ego, Shigaraki-san. The ebony-haired man huffed, his demeanor how it always was, on the surface, at least. Goodness, he snickered. You're quite right, my dear. Wherever are my manners? He hummed before redirecting his attention towards the boy he'd been grooming for such a great and glorious purpose. Not that he'd completely given up on the idea, of course. There were still many ways that the boy could prove useful in his new ventures, after all. All 3 of the men before him, in fact, would be. Of that he was certain. Well then, Tomura, I am your captive audience. He grinned. What have you to say? Sucking in a breath, the former Shimura, the former Shigaraki, straightened his shoulders and looked the man he'd once trusted above everyone and anything else in his dark, ancient eyes.
Out of all the quirks you could have given me, why this one?
It had been something he'd had to stop himself from obsessing over, something he'd told himself time and time again to forget about because, well, what difference did it make? The damage to his skin, to Mon-chan and his blood family had already been done. Knowing the cause wouldn't change anything, but, no matter how illogical, he needed to know. Do you recall the first time we officially met? Blinking, he nodded. Do you remember the conversation we had on that bright sunny morning,
You asked me why I was alone.
He replied, his shoulders slumping.
You wanted to know why I wasn't off playing with my friends, and I started to cry.
He admitted, his arms folding defensively across his middle. Yes, you were such a delicate, sensitive, wretched little thing. The fiend mused, his tone gentle despite the harsh criticism that had Show shifting in his seat and Dobby grumbling under his breath. Just like with his lover, their guardian had promised not to intervene unless he felt it necessary. Slights, cruel words, and patronization were all part and parcel of who the old bastard sat across from them was, weren't they? That's when you told me you were quirkless and that you'd scampered off to that grassy knoll to play pretend hero, because you never could be one, because the other children laughed at you in the bigger playground, that your father had forbidden such play. He furthered, and then in an act of charity and mercy, I asked you if you'd like to have a quirk. And what did you say? Why, you said yes. You begged me for a quirk, a power strong enough to... What was the expression you used? To change the world, he crowed. Listening, Tomer felt his throat seizing, his mouth drying. You asked for something extraordinary, something that'd help to make your father see how wrong he was to hurt you and cast your dreams aside. Well, you certainly showed him, didn't you, my boy? Fuck, it had been his... I've obviously not been visiting you enough. Balking, his head jerked around his shoulder on his left, the eatery owner shaking his head at the still smiling crime lord. You've not spouted this much spiteful verbal diarrhea for a while, Shigadaki-san. It's incredibly childish and unbecoming of a man of your years to lay the blame and burden of your failed plans at the feet of the person who bested you, wouldn't you say? He shrugged. Damn straight! Blinking, he felt his head turn to the right, where Dabi was sat, those beautiful eyes rolling. You know what, Oji-san? There is a whole lot of nonsense you're trying to sell, he told him flatly. You took advantage of a child in a moment of crisis, and now you're making out that this is somehow his fault. He huffed, that caustic gaze narrowing. You're just full of shit, Grandpa. The next thing we know, you'll be blaming the sky for being blue, won't you, huh? Oji-san? Grandpa? Savannah laughed, that sound oddly merry, oddly pleased as he shifted gears once again. The looming pleasure he'd seen building in that slightly wrinkled countenance softened with something more delighted? So I've not been cast from your fold then, Shouta-kun, why ever didn't you tell me that I was kin to you all, eh? He smiled, his eyes glinting. You know, I have side children, many in fact, he allowed, and he knew he could feel the shock of such news rippling across his family at his sides and the stiffening guards. Most long dead, I'm sure. That's what you get for living well over 300 years. He mused lightly. And since my plans, my attempts at chasing up and pinning down my dear little brother has always proved fruitless, I'd not given much thought as to what I could be missing by not taking a partner and raising my whelps, he added casually. God, who talked about having kids like that? That was, of course, until I was shown the benefits of such things by you, by all of you and what you've built at the adorable little eatery of yours, he continued blandly, and at the old demon's purring tone, he couldn't help the sudden and certain sense of dread that had crept up his back and goosebumped his skin.
You're up to something,
he heard himself say, his uncle's, his sensei's, his grandfather's eyes meeting his once more. Am I? He did it, those old yet powerful shoulders rolling as much as they could under the copious clothes fastened and buckled around him. Oh, but let's not talk on such matters now, he offered kindly. No, let's talk on other things, Such as, what are you to do with yourself now, pray tell? I offered you the opportunity to rule the world at my side, and you squandered it. He sighed, his head shaking. So what now? Oh, please don't tell me that you've traded in the opportunity to be a god amongst men for something as small and domestic as, I don't know, a career? Trying to push the dread that their earlier exchange had instilled in him to one side for now, Tomer sighed.
Having a domestic life isn't anything to look down on.
He told him plainly, his lips trying to smile, but if he did, it was a small, slightly bitter thing.
I suppose I'd have to agree with you. And with my father. About one thing, though.
He managed.
Being a pretty hero, running around in silly outfits and capes that isn't what society should be built on.
He admitted before looking to Shouta, a true smile now reaching his eyes.
Hell, if the four of us can agree on anything, it's that heroes, the real ones, are people who make a positive difference in the world through generosity and understanding.
He furthered his resolve, strengthening.
And yes, through something as mundane as a career, I want to do that. I deserve that, even after everything, because you may have made me into something that you say I wanted, but now I can remake myself into someone I want to be.
He said,
that's why I'm going to a local university. Gabby and I both are. We're going to keep working shifts at the cafe. We're going to tutor the smalls. We'll keep visiting UA with our friends, and in a few years' time, we'll marry each other.
He added while Sensei regarded him. His expression was contemplative? Unblinking, he continued.
And we're going to laugh. We're going to live.
And we're going to change as much as the world as we can for the better. He stated.
And you know what, rightly or wrongly, I want to share some of that with you too.
He added, a little snicker bubbling up and out of him when the other blinked at him owlishly.
OG sound does sound better than Sensei, don't you think?